The crystal flute of champagne sat sweating on the marble coaster, a perfect circle of condensation forming beneath it, much like the ring of cold indifference that had slowly suffocated their marriage. It was meant to be a private conversation, the final severance of a decade-long bond. But when the call connected, the distinct, tinny echo of a speakerphone filled the room, followed by the cruel, chime-like laughter of women who enjoyed tragedies that weren't their own. He didn't hang up. He simply waited, his finger hovering over a file that would turn their amusement into ash. If you find yourself drawn to the quiet moments before a storm, where secrets unravel in the most devastating ways, stay with me as we turn the page. The rain in Chicago had a way of looking like static against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, a relentless, gray interference that matched the noise in Ethan Vance's head. He sat in the wingback leather chair of his study, the room illuminated only by the glow of his tablet and the ambient city lights from 40 stories down. On the screen before him wasn't a blueprint or a contract, but a series of bank transfers. They were complex, layered through shell companies, but to an architect's eye, they were just another form of structural failure. He took a sip of his scotch, the liquid amber burning pleasantly as it went down, grounding him. He had been waiting for this moment for 6 months. He just hadn't expected it to arrive tonight. His phone, resting on the mahogany desk, began to buzz. The screen lit up with a photo taken 3 years ago. Clara, laughing, her hair wind-blown on a boat in Lake Geneva. It felt like looking at a ghost. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the decline button, but then he saw the time. 10:45 p.m. It was Friday. She was at the Avery with her inner circle. Ethan answered, but he didn't speak. He didn't say hello. He just listened. Told you he would pick up on the first ring. He's probably sitting there waiting for me to come home. Clara's voice floated through the line, slightly slurred, amplified by the hollow echo of a speakerphone. Ethan remained silent, placing his own phone on the desk, watching the seconds tick by on the call timer. "Go on, Clara, do it," another voice urged. It sounded like Jessica, a woman whose 3 divorces were worn like combat medals. "Ethan?" Clara's voice sharpened, performing for her audience. "Are you there?" "I'm here, Clara," Ethan said. His voice was steady, a low baritone that betrayed nothing. He picked up his pen and tapped it rhythmically against the edge of the tablet. "Good, because I didn't want to wait until morning," she said, her tone breezy, artificially light. "I'm finalizing the divorce, Ethan. I spoke to the lawyers today. I want the penthouse and I want the settlement we discussed. I'm done pretending this works." There was a pause, followed by a ripple of giggles from the background. The sound was sharp, piercing through the quiet sanctity of his study. They were laughing. They were drinking vintage Pinot Noir that he had likely paid for, laughing at the dismantling of his life. "Oh, don't be sad, darling," Jessica's voice chimed in, distant but audible. "You can keep the dog." More laughter, a clinking of glasses. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, exhaling a long breath. He didn't feel the sting of humiliation he thought he would. Instead, he felt a strange, cold clarity. The final strut had been removed. The collapse was now controlled. He looked down at the bank transfer records on his tablet, the ones linking Clara's signature to Julian Blackwood's offshore accounts. He leaned forward, bringing his face closer to the phone. "Are you finished?" Ethan asked. The laughter on the other end died down, replaced by a confused silence. His tone hadn't risen. It had dropped, colder than the wind battering the glass outside. "Excuse me?" Clara asked, her bravado faltering slightly. "I asked if you were finished," Ethan repeated. "Because you have me on speaker, Clara, and I assume Jessica, Sarah, and likely Julian are there with you." The silence on the line grew heavy, thick with sudden tension. The mention of the name Julian sucked the air out of the room at the Avery. "How?" Clara started, then stopped. "Since we are sharing news publicly," Ethan continued, his eyes tracing the timestamp on the wildest transaction, "I think it's only fair I tell you something too. I didn't speak to a divorce lawyer today, Clara. I spoke to the FBI regarding the $300,000 you moved from the gallery's operating fund to Julian's shell company in the Caymans." The background noise in the restaurant seemed to vanish. "Ethan, stop," Clara whispered, the speakerphone now betraying the tremble in her voice. "No, don't turn off the speaker," Ethan commanded, his voice hardening into steel. "Your friends found the divorce funny. Let's see if they find a federal embezzlement indictment just as entertaining." He reached out and tapped the end call button, leaving the silence to ring in his empty office, louder than any laughter ever could. The Uber ride from the Avery to the Gold Coast was suffocatingly quiet. Usually, after a dinner like that, Clara's phone would be lighting up with group chat notifications, memes about the waiter, critiques of the risotto, or vicious gossip about whoever hadn't been invited. Tonight, the screen remained dark, a slab of black glass reflecting her own pale, smeared makeup. The friends hadn't offered her a ride. Jessica had suddenly remembered an early Pilates session. Sarah had claimed a migraine the moment Ethan hung up. They had scattered like roaches when the kitchen light is flipped on, terrified that the federal indictment Ethan mentioned might be contagious. Clara stepped out of the car onto the wet pavement of East Delaware Place. The wind off the lake was biting, whipping her trench coat around her legs. She shivered, not just from the cold, but from the residual adrenaline of the phone call. He was bluffing, she told herself for the 10th time. Ethan was meticulous, yes, but he was also soft. He loved routine. He loved her, or at least the idea of her. He wouldn't blow up his own life just to spite her. She pushed through the heavy revolving doors into the lobby. The warmth of the building usually felt like an embrace, the scent of white tea and cedar welcoming her to her sanctuary. Henry, the night concierge who had greeted her by name for 5 years, was behind the marble desk. Usually, he would smile and ask about her evening. Tonight, he didn't look up from his computer screen until she was standing directly in front of him. "Good evening, Henry," Clara said, the habit of authority still in her voice. Henry flinched slightly, his eyes shifting away from hers. "Mrs. Vance." "Just Clara, please. I forgot my fob in my other bag," she lied smoothly, reaching for the elevator call button. "Could you buzz me up?" "I'm afraid I can't do that, ma'am." Clara's hand froze mid-air. She turned slowly. "Excuse me?" Henry looked genuinely pained, his professional mask slipping. "Mr. Vance left specific instructions with the building management and the board an hour ago. He provided legal documentation. You've been removed from the access list effective immediately." "This is my home," Clara hissed, her voice rising. The quiet elegance of the lobby suddenly felt like a courtroom. "I am on the deed, Henry. You open that elevator right now or I will have your job by morning." "The deed is under the Vance Architecture Trust," Henry said softly, reciting what he had likely been told to say. "And the restraining order regarding the property was filed electronically tonight. If you refuse to leave, I have to call the police." Please, Mrs. Vance. Don't make me do that. Clara stared at him. The humiliation was a physical blow, sharper than the cold outside. Restraining order? It was absurd. It was war. She spun around, her heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor as she retreated to a seating area near the window. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed Ethan. Straight to voicemail. She dialed again. Voicemail. She opened her banking app. She needed a hotel. The Langham was 2 blocks away. She would stay there and call her lawyer in the morning. She would make Ethan pay for this stunt. She logged in. The Face ID wheel spun for a second before the dashboard loaded. Checking account ending in 4490, 000, frozen. Savings account ending in 8821, 000, frozen. Joint credit line, card blocked, contact issuer. The numbers stared back at her, absolute and unforgiving. Ethan hadn't just changed the locks. He had cut the oxygen. A notification slid down from the top of the screen. It wasn't Ethan. It was a text from Julian. Julian, 11:15 p.m. Don't come to the loft. My lawyers are advising zero contact until we see what Ethan actually has. Delete this thread. Clara read the message twice. The man she had risked her marriage for, the man she had funneled art gallery funds to under the guise of consulting fees, was cutting her loose before the first shot was even fired. She looked up. Henry was watching her from the desk, his hand hovering near the phone, waiting for her to make a scene. Clara stood up. She smoothed her coat, though her hands felt numb. She wouldn't scream. She wouldn't give Ethan the satisfaction of hearing about her breakdown from the doorman. She walked back out through the revolving doors, into the hostile Chicago night. She had nowhere to go, no money to get there, and for the first time in her life, no audience to applaud her tragedy. The conference room at Vance & Associates was a glass box suspended 20 stories above the Chicago River. It was designed to feel weightless, but to Ethan, the air inside felt heavy. Pressurized by the stack of documents sitting in the center of the table. Across from him sat Marcus Thorne, his corporate attorney. A man who wore suits that cost more than most people's cars and possessed a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Today, however, Marcus wasn't smiling. This is the affidavit regarding the unauthorized transfers, Marcus said, sliding a single sheet of paper across the polished teak surface. Once you sign this, Ethan, there is no taking it back. We are formally stating that you had no knowledge of the gallery's transactions with Julian Blackwood's shell companies. It clears the firm, but it places the liability squarely on the gallery director. On Clara, Ethan corrected, his voice rough. He hadn't slept. He had spent the night in the office, watching the sun rise over a city that felt significantly colder than it had the day before. On the person who signed the checks, Marcus said pragmatically. The FBI isn't looking for a marriage counselor, Ethan. They are looking for a fall guy. If it's not her, it's you. Your signature is on the firm's operating agreement. If you don't separate your assets and your knowledge base now, you go down with the ship. Ethan picked up the Mont Blanc pen. It felt heavy in his hand. He thought of Clara, not the woman laughing on the speakerphone last night, but the woman he had married 10 years ago, the one who used to bring him coffee when he worked late, before the gallery, before the ambition, before Julian. Signing this wasn't just ending a marriage, it was potentially handing her a prison sentence. She called me this morning, Ethan said quietly. 12 times. And you didn't answer, Marcus stated, not asking. Good, because she is currently in the lobby. Ethan's head snapped up. What? Security alerted me 5 minutes ago. She's demanding to see you. Down in the lobby, the scene was far less sterile. Clara stood before the reception desk, her posture rigid, her knuckles white as she gripped her designer handbag. She was wearing sunglasses indoors, a futile attempt to hide the redness of her eyes and the fact that she was wearing the same coat as the night before. "I don't think you understand," Clara said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "I am his wife. I don't need an appointment to see my husband." The receptionist, a young woman named Sarah whom Clara had once criticized for wearing cheap perfume, looked at her with a mix of pity and professional detachment. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Vance. Mr. Vance is in a high-priority meeting. His instructions are clear. No visitors." "I'm not a visitor," Clara snapped, slamming her hand on the desk. The sound echoed through the high-ceilinged atrium, causing a few clients in the waiting area to look up. "Call him. Tell him if he doesn't come down here, I will scream the house down." "Mrs. Vance." A deep voice rumbled from behind her. Clara turned to see the head of building security, a man she had walked past 1,000 times without acknowledging. He wasn't smiling. "We've been asked to escort you out," he said, his tone polite but final. "Please don't make this difficult." Clara looked from the security guard to the elevators. The digital numbers above the doors were counting up. Floor 18, 19, 20. He was right there, just a few hundred feet of steel and concrete away, but he felt miles distant. For a moment she considered making a run for the turnstiles, considered screaming Julian's name, considered shattering the veneer of respectability she had spent years polishing. But then she saw the security guard's hand drift toward his radio. She realized with a sickening lurch that she no longer held the power in this dynamic. She wasn't the architect's wife anymore. She was a security risk. Up in the glass box, Ethan watched the feed on Marcus's laptop. He saw Clara turn around, shoulders slumped, and walk toward the revolving doors. She looked small, defeated. "Ethan," Marcus prompted gently, tapping the paper. Ethan looked away from the screen. He remembered the laughter at the Avery. He remembered the cruelty of the speakerphone. He remembered that she hadn't just cheated. She had tried to make him a laughingstock while stealing from the life he built. He uncapped the pen. The tip scratched against the paper, a sharp, irreversible sound. "File it," Ethan said, standing up and turning his back to the window. "I'm done." Julian Blackwood's loft in the West Loop was a testament to curated bachelorhood. Exposed brick, polished concrete floors, and oversized abstract art that Clara had personally selected for him from the gallery's inventory. Usually, walking into this space made her feel electric, a secret thrill of rebellion against the structured, predictable life she shared with Ethan. Today, however, the air in the loft smelled of dust and panic. When Julian finally buzzed her up, he didn't meet her at the door with a glass of wine or a lingering touch. The heavy steel door was left unlatched, swinging open to reveal a scene of controlled chaos. 2 large Toomey suitcases lay open on the cowhide rug, half filled with clothes. The sleek glass desk, usually pristine, was covered in shredded documents. "You took your time letting me in," Clara said, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. She waited for him to turn around, to see her distress, to offer the sanctuary she had blown up her life to secure. Julian didn't look up. He was standing by the bookshelf, rapidly pulling down binders and tossing them into a black trash bag. "I'm busy, Clara," he said, his voice clipped. "You shouldn't be here. If Ethan's lawyers are tracking your phone, you're leading them right to my doorstep." Clara froze, her handbag slipping from her shoulder. "Ethan knows. He knows everything." He froze the accounts. He locked me out of the penthouse. I have nothing, Julian. I need you to transfer some funds to a clean account for me, just until the divorce settlement kicks in. Julian finally stopped. He turned slowly, holding a thick ledger in his hand. For the first time, Clara noticed the sheen of sweat on his forehead and the way his usually impeccable shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. He looked at her not with desire, but with the annoyance one might feel toward a lingering guest. "The divorce settlement?" Julian repeated, letting out a dry, humorless laugh. "Clara, wake up. There isn't going to be a settlement. There's going to be an indictment." "Ethan is just scaring me," Clara insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. She took a step toward him. "We can fix this. You said the transfers were structured as consulting fees. You said it was airtight." "It was airtight until you decided to announce our affair on speakerphone to half of Chicago," Julian snapped, throwing the ledger into the bag. "You forced his hand. Ethan is a lot of things, but he isn't stupid. Once you humiliated him, he stopped protecting the gallery. He handed the books to the feds this morning." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "He told you?" "My contacts at the bank told me. My accounts are flagged, Clara, which is why I'm leaving for Zurich tonight." "Okay," Clara breathed, clutching at the lifeline. "Okay, Zurich is fine. I can pack. I just need to stop by my mother's house to get—" "No," Julian interrupted. The word was soft, but it hit her like a physical slap. "Not we. Me." Clara stared at him, the silence in the loft stretching until it screamed. "I don't understand." Julian zipped up the first suitcase, setting it upright with a decisive click. He looked at her then, and the mask of the attentive lover completely dissolved. What remained was the cold calculation of a businessman cutting a loss. "You were the gallery director, Clara," he said, speaking slowly as if to a child. "Your signature is on the checks. Your login approved the wires. I was just a vendor, a consultant. If they come looking, I'm just a bad investment you made." "I did that for us," she whispered, tears finally spilling over. "I destroyed my marriage for you." "You destroyed your marriage because you were bored," Julian corrected, checking his watch. "And because you liked the thrill. Don't rewrite history to make yourself a martyr." "You enjoyed the game as much as I did." He walked past her, grabbing his coat from the rack. He didn't even pause to wipe the tears from her cheek. He moved around her like she was a piece of furniture that no longer fit the aesthetic of the room. "You need to leave," Julian said, opening the door and holding it for her. "I have a car coming in 5 minutes. And Clara, don't call me. The number won't work anymore." Clara stood there, looking at the man she had chosen over Ethan. In the harsh afternoon light pouring through the industrial windows, she saw him clearly for the first time. There was no romance here. There never had been. She hadn't been his partner. She had been his shield. She turned and walked out into the hallway, the sound of the heavy steel door engaging the deadbolt behind her echoing like a gunshot. She was alone in the corridor, suspended between the life she had burned down and the future that had just locked her out. The headline hit the Crane's Chicago business website at 6:15 a.m. Gold Coast Gallery director implicated in six-figure embezzlement scheme. By 8:00 a.m., the link had circulated through every group chat, boardroom, and charity committee in the city. Clara sat in the corner of a generic Starbucks on Michigan Avenue, her sunglasses on despite the overcast gloom outside. She gripped a paper cup of black coffee. Her cards were still declined, so she had paid with the loose cash found in the bottom of her purse. Her phone, which she had finally turned back on, was vibrating incessantly against the laminate table. It wasn't Julian. It wasn't her friends. It was the Tribune, Chicago Magazine, and a dozen gossip blogs asking for a comment on her alleged fraud. She needed to get to the gallery. If she could just get to her office, she could access the physical files. She could find a paper trail that Julian might have missed. She could prove she was manipulated, not malicious. She pulled her coat tight and stepped out into the morning rush. The gallery was only 2 blocks away, a sleek, minimalist space that she had curated from the ground up. It was her identity. Without it, she was just a divorced woman with no money and a looming criminal record. As she approached the glass facade, she saw it. A piece of white paper was taped to the inside of the glass door. It was discreet, professional, and devastating. Closed for internal audit. Clara pushed against the door. Locked. She punched her code into the keypad. The light flashed red. Access denied. Inside, she saw the silhouette of a woman moving near the reception desk. It was Sophie, her assistant, the girl Clara had hired fresh out of college, the girl Clara had mentored. "Sophie!" Clara knocked on the glass, forgetting the people walking by on the sidewalk. "Sophie, let me in! I need to get my laptop!" Sophie looked up. For a second, their eyes met through the rain-streaked glass. There was no warmth in Sophie's gaze, only a terrified self-preservation. She looked at Clara like she was a stranger, or worse, a contagion. Sophie slowly shook her head, then turned her back and walked into the rear office, disappearing from view. Clara stood there, her hand resting on the cold glass. The rejection was absolute. She wasn't just fired, she was being erased. Across the city, in the quiet sanctuary of his office, Ethan read the same article on his iPad. He didn't feel the surge of vindication he had expected. He didn't feel the thrill of the winner. Instead, he felt a heavy, leaden weight settle in his chest. He looked at the photo the press had used. A picture of Clara from the agonizingly pretentious Arts and Winter Gala last year. She looked beautiful, radiant, and untouchable. Now she was clickbait. "The board of the gallery just issued a statement," Marcus said, stepping into Ethan's office without knocking. "They are fully cooperating with the FBI. They've terminated Clara's contract for cause, effective immediately. They are throwing her to the wolves to save the brand." Ethan set the iPad face down on his desk. "I warned her," he said, his voice low. "I told her exactly what would happen." "You did," Marcus agreed, sitting opposite him. "And she chose to laugh at you on speakerphone. This is the fallout, Ethan. It's ugly, but it's necessary. If you hadn't moved first, that headline would say Vance family instead of gallery director." "I know," Ethan said, standing up and walking to the window. The city looked the same as it always did. Gray, steel, unyielding. But down there, somewhere in the grid, the woman he had shared a bed with for 10 years was watching her life disintegrate. He remembered the way Clara used to look at him when they first met, before the money, before the social climbing. There was a softness there once. "It doesn't feel like a win, Marcus," Ethan admitted, watching a train snake its way along the L tracks. "It's not a win," Marcus replied softly. "It's a survival strategy, and you survived." Ethan closed his eyes. He had survived, yes. But as he pictured Clara standing outside the locked doors of her own gallery, a scene he could visualize with painful clarity, he knew that the silence he had craved was finally here. And it was deafening. The wind off Lake Michigan was brutal, a sharp, physical force that made conversation difficult. It was the kind of weather that kept the casual joggers inside, leaving the concrete path along the water gray and desolate. Ethan sat on a metal bench facing the slate-gray water. He had chosen this spot because it was nowhere near the penthouse, nowhere near the gallery, and nowhere near the law firm. It was neutral territory. He heard her footsteps before he saw her. Unlike the confident click of stilettos he had known for a decade, these were soft, scuffing sounds, sneakers against pavement. Clara sat down on the other end of the bench. She didn't look at him. She stared out at the water, her hands buried deep in the pockets of a beige wool coat he didn't recognize. It looked older, perhaps something she had dug out of the back of a closet, or maybe something borrowed. She wasn't wearing sunglasses. Her face was exposed to the biting wind, pale and devoid of makeup. The meticulously crafted persona of the art gallery director was gone. What remained was just a tired woman shivering in the cold. "You came," she said, her voice snatching away in the wind. "You asked me to," Ethan replied, keeping his eyes on the horizon. They sat in silence for a long moment, the distance between them on the bench feeling wider than the lake itself. "I'm staying at my mother's in Schaumburg," Clara said quietly. "It's small. The guest room still has my high school debate trophies on the shelf." Ethan nodded. He knew her mother was difficult, a woman who measured success by zip codes. Returning there was a specific kind of hell for Clara. "Why, Ethan?" she asked, finally turning her head to look at his profile. "I get the divorce. I get the anger. But the FBI, the audit, you nuked everything. You made sure I could never work in this city again. Was it just because I put you on speaker?" Ethan took a slow breath. The cold air stung his lungs. "It wasn't the speakerphone, Clara," he said softly. "The speakerphone was just the moment I stopped lying to myself." He turned to look at her. Her eyes were red-rimmed, not from crying, but from exhaustion. "You didn't just cheat," Ethan continued, his voice steady but devoid of malice. "You brought a thief into our lives. You used my name, my firm's reputation, to give him credibility. You risked my freedom to impress a man who didn't even care enough to pack a bag for you." Clara flinched. The truth of Julian's abandonment was a wound that hadn't even begun to scab over. "I was lonely," she whispered, the excuse sounding fragile in the open air. "You were always working. You were always building things for other people. Julian, he paid attention. He made me feel like the center of the room." "I was working to pay for the room," Ethan corrected gently. "And you weren't the center of the room, Clara. You were the mark." Clara looked down at her hands. I know that now." A wave crashed against the concrete barrier below them, sending a spray of mist into the air. "I don't hate you," Ethan said, and he was surprised to find it was true. The rage had burned out days ago, leaving only a hollow ache. "But I couldn't let you drag me down. I had to cut the rope." "So that's it?" Clara asked, tears finally welling in her eyes. 10 years, and we just end? No shouting, no fighting for it? "We ended a long time ago," Ethan said. "We were just polite enough not to say it out loud until Friday." He stood up. The cold was seeping through his coat, settling into his bones. He looked at her one last time, the woman he had promised to love and cherish. She looked small against the backdrop of the vast, indifferent city. "My lawyer is sending over a temporary stipend agreement tomorrow," Ethan said. "It's not a settlement. It's just enough to help you get a place of your own, so you don't have to stay in Schaumburg." Clara looked up at him, surprise flickering across her face. "Why?" "Because you were my wife," Ethan said simply, "and because nobody deserves to be laughed at." He turned and walked away down the path, the wind at his back, leaving her alone on the bench with the sound of the waves. The grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hilton was a cavern of gold leaf and velvet, suffocated by the scent of fresh lilies and old money. The winter solstice ball was the event of the season, a black-tie obligation that Chicago's elite attended not to have fun, but to be seen. Ethan stood near the bar, nursing a sparkling water. He was there for two reasons: to reassure his firm's biggest investors that the Vance scandal hadn't impacted their portfolios, and to prove he wasn't hiding. He looked impeccable in his tuxedo, though his face was sharper, harder than it had been a month ago. Across the room, Clara stood alone. She had come because she was on the organizing committee, a role she had fought for years to secure. To not show up would have been an admission of total defeat. She wore a deep emerald gown, one of the few pieces left that didn't feel like a costume, but her posture was brittle. The crowd moved around her like water around a stone, giving her a wide berth while whispering behind raised champagne flutes. Ethan watched as Jessica and Sarah, the ringleaders of the speakerphone incident, detached themselves from a group of bankers and glided toward Clara. They moved with the predatory grace of sharks sensing blood in the water. Ethan set his glass down. He didn't owe Clara anything. She had made her bed. But as he watched Jessica lean in, a sickly, sweet smile plastered on her face, he felt a surge of cold distaste. These women hadn't just watched Clara destruct. They had handed her the matches. He began to move through the crowd. "Just surprised you could afford the ticket, darling," Jessica was saying, her voice pitched perfectly to carry to the surrounding tables. "I heard Julian is enjoying Zurich. Did he send a postcard, or just a legal bill?" Clara stood rigid, her face draining of color. "Please, Jessica, not here." "We're just worried about you," Sarah added, touching Clara's arm with feigned sympathy. It must be so embarrassing, being the only one in the room who doesn't know she's a joke. A few people nearby chuckled, the same low, chime-like laughter Ethan had heard over the phone. "That's enough." The voice was low, but it cut through the conversation like a razor. Ethan stepped into the circle, placing himself physically between Clara and the women. He didn't look at Clara. His gaze was fixed on Jessica. Jessica blinked, her smile faltering. "Ethan, we were just comforting." "You were gloating," Ethan corrected, his tone conversational but freezing. "And frankly, Jessica, considering your own husband is currently under investigation for insider trading, I'd be careful about throwing stones in glass ballrooms." The color vanished from Jessica's face. The circle of eavesdroppers suddenly found their shoes very interesting. "Clara made a mistake," Ethan continued, addressing the group but looking at no one in particular. "We are handling it. But she is still the mother of She was my wife for 10 years, and unlike you, she has owned her failures." He turned to Clara. She was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen in years. Gratitude, mixed with a profound, aching shame. "Do you have a ride?" Ethan asked quietly. "I took a cab," she whispered. "My driver is outside," Ethan said. "He'll take you to Schaumburg. Go, you don't need to be here." "Ethan," she started, her voice cracking. "Go," he repeated, softer this time. Clara nodded, pulling her wrap tight around her shoulders. She didn't look back at Jessica or the friends who had cheered for her downfall. She walked toward the exit, her head held slightly higher than before. Ethan watched her leave, the emerald dress disappearing through the heavy double doors. He didn't follow her. He turned back to the bar, picked up his water, and waited for the next client to approach. The room was quieter now. The gossip had shifted, but for the first time in months, the noise didn't bother him. The divorce decree didn't come with a gavel bang or a dramatic speech. It arrived in a standard manila envelope, delivered by a courier to Ethan's new office, a converted brownstone in Lincoln Park that smelled of old wood and fresh coffee, miles away from the glass tower he had left behind. Ethan slid the document out. Dissolution of marriage. Final judgment. He signed the receipt, thanked the courier, and placed the paper in his drawer. It felt anticlimactic, like finishing a long book only to find the last page blank. That afternoon, he returned to the Gold Coast penthouse one last time. The sale had closed yesterday to a young tech CEO who wanted the view for his Instagram feed. The apartment was empty now. The art was gone. The Italian furniture was gone. The marble coaster where the champagne flute had sat that night was gone. Ethan walked through the rooms, his footsteps echoing against the bare hardwood. He stood in the kitchen, where he had made coffee for 10 years, looking for a ghost, but he found none. The anger, the humiliation, the sound of the laughter, it had all evaporated, leaving only a quiet, dusty stillness. He realized then that he wasn't mourning the marriage anymore. He was simply acknowledging that it had existed. He left the keys on the counter and walked out, the door clicking shut with a finality that felt like a release. A week later, on a Tuesday, Ethan found himself in Ravenswood, a neighborhood of brick bungalows and small businesses, far removed from the high-stakes glitz of downtown. He was meeting a contractor about a renovation project. As he walked down the street, buttoning his coat against the autumn chill, he stopped. Across the street was a small, cluttered shop, Community Art and Frame. Ideally, he would have kept walking, but curiosity, that dangerous human flaw, anchored his feet. Through the large front window, he saw her. Clara was standing behind the counter. She wore a heavy knit sweater and jeans, her hair tied back in a messy bun. She was framing a child's drawing for a customer, an elderly woman who was talking animatedly. Clara wasn't checking her watch. She wasn't looking over the woman's shoulder for someone more important. She was listening. She smiled, a small, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. She looked tired. She looked older. The sharp, polished veneer of the gallery director was gone, stripped away by the scandal and the social exile. But she also looked solid, real. The Clara of the penthouse, the woman who needed an audience to feel alive, had vanished. In her place was someone who was learning, perhaps for the first time, how to exist without applause. Ethan watched her for a moment longer. He considered crossing the street. He could say hello. He could tell her he hoped she was okay. But he knew that was his ego talking. Any contact would just be picking at a scar that was finally fading for both of them. She had her consequences. He had his peace. The customer in the shop laughed at something Clara said, and this time the laughter was warm. It didn't echo. It didn't hurt. Ethan turned up his collar against the wind. He stepped away from the window, merging back into the flow of pedestrians on the sidewalk. He had a meeting to get to. He had a new house to design. And for the first time in a long time, the silence in his head wasn't waiting to be filled. It was just quiet.